without any further ado, I am very, very proud to ask the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable John Key, to address you in my electorate. Thank you.
Jodie, thanks a lot. It's great to be here in Ashburton. I do have a depth of knowledge about the Rakaia Bridge, and that is don't drive over it at speed when it's icy in the winter, because many years ago when I was about 14 and my sister was 16, she did just that and managed to spin the car around and dent every single panel on the car, which was not a great amusement to my mother at the time when we brought back her car in about 15 pieces. So I have great respect for that bridge. But look, I thought I might just talk to you about a few quick things and then get on to any sort of questions that you want. But let me first start with the earthquake in Christchurch. I think all of you have read, seen, experienced, had a lot of opportunities to get great knowledge of what's happened there. And as Joe said, you've done a great job helping the people of Christchurch. But just to put a bit of perspective around it, we look at earthquakes on the Richter scale, so you know that they are exponential. The bigger the number, the more powerful they are. And so a 9 on the Richter scale, as they had in Japan, is arguably 1,000 times more powerful than 6.3 in Christchurch. So that is one way of looking at an earthquake, and you'll know that the first one that took place on the 4th of September was a 7.1. So you'd be excused for thinking the earthquake should have done a lot less damage as a result of the second earthquake, which was only 6.3. The problem was that is one way of looking at earthquakes. The second way of looking at them is on a thing called the Mercalli Index, and that measures lateral land movement, how fast the land is moving. So what happened as a result of this February 22nd earthquake was there was a very violent, short, sharp lateral land movement, caused primarily, I think, because the Port Hills, which absorbed the shock, basically it takes that energy in and has to release it. And so the effect of that was the devastation that you saw in the CBD and the eastern suburbs. Put a bit of perspective around that. The first earthquake was a 6 out of 12 on the Mercalli Index. The second earthquake was a 9 out of 12. And they don't get a lot worse than about 9 or 10. In fact, I think the press might have been saying yesterday it was the biggest event that's happened actually in that sort of type of movement. So in one sense, one area to take a bit of confidence from is that the buildings have actually held up for the most part extremely well there. So what's happening is we have a Royal Commission of Inquiry. It's going to look at, firstly, 4 buildings we identified, as well as a Department of Building and Housing also have an investigation of these 4 buildings. So that is the CTV building, the PGC building, Forsyth Bar and the Hotel Grand Chancellor. And what we know from the CTV building is that the significant loss of life took place there. So what's going to happen with the Royal Commission is it's going to come back and say, are the building standards in the code in Christchurch, is it set at the right level? Because we set it at different levels around the country. So some things are consistent and some are built to reflect the perceived earthquake risk. So just to give you an idea, we previously built Christchurch for a 1 in 500 year risk. So obviously if we think earthquakes are going to be of a more significant nature, we built a higher code. So that's true in Wellington, which is built to a 1 in 1,000 year risk. So when we look at the shock that took place as, say, very violent, short, sharp lateral movement, when we overlay the power of that on the buildings in Christchurch, what we know is they experienced somewhere between a 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 2,500 year shock. So that was a very large shock against a code that was built for a much lower standard than the perception of that. So while there's going to be a lot of buildings that will ultimately be demolished in Christchurch, what you can say is most buildings actually came through extremely well. They actually performed better than people would have expected, and for the most part, we can be very happy with them. Now, obviously, we've had 1 or 2 that need much closer analysis, but that's the first thing, just to give you an idea there. Second thing is that it is true that there are issues with some of the land in the eastern suburbs. Now, we won't know immediately what that means, but we know that the Port Hills has gone up. Reports of anything from sort of 40 centimetres to a metre, and in the eastern suburbs it's fallen in parts up to a metre, which means that some of the eastern suburbs are either at sea level, potentially below sea level, and prone to flooding. So one of the decisions that will have to be made when we look at rebuilding parts of the eastern suburbs is can that take place? Can we actually fix up the land? What's the cost of doing it? And also, will it be a house that is then still reinsurable? So if it's terribly prone to flooding, you might get to a situation where the insurance companies won't insure it. So they're all the sorts of things that we're having to work our way through. We need to be able to give people certainty as quickly as we can, because obviously there's a great deal of anxiety for people. They want to move on with their lives and they want to understand what that might all mean. So there's a lot of complexity. Yesterday we announced that the organisation that's going to be responsible for that set up a new government department, the Christchurch or Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, CERA as it's affectionately known. And it's a very powerful entity, but it does need to be powerful. So it needs to be able to make decisions, and it broadly needs to have the same powers as the civil defence emergency powers that come off or will come off when CERA comes into play. So obviously we want to work very collaboratively with Christchurch City Council, the other supporting councils and the other interested parties. There's a cross-party forum, there's a community forum. Christchurch has the lead role on CBD rebuild. But in the end, that organisation does have to be able to make some calls and it does have to have powers. We've done the best that we can to make sure that those powers, there's a control check on them, but that's an important part of the process that can make decisions. So that's what's happening there. Very quickly, just in terms of paying for the earthquake, let me just give you a run through how that works. So one great thing about New Zealand is that we have a high level of insurance or provisioning for a major natural disaster. So if you look at EQC, the way that works is when you take house insurance and you take fire insurance, roughly you pay $60 into EQC. So that $60 is used for two things. Some of it goes into a kitty to build up a fund, and the second bit is to buy reinsurance. So if you go back to my sister's car that she managed to write off, or more precisely my mother's car that she managed to write off on the Rakaia Bridge, the first, let's say, $500 would have been our responsibility, and the balance would have been paid by the insurance company. Well, it's like that with EQC. So if we have a major natural disaster, EQC pays the first $1.5 billion, then reinsurance kicks in for another $2.5 billion, and if the total cost is above $4 billion, then the costs pretty much come back to the government. So we have $6.4 billion in EQC. We've had two natural disasters that are deemed to be independent events for the purposes of EQC. So we can take $1.5 billion out for each event out of EQC. So $3 billion comes out, that leaves us with $3.4 billion. We can actually, under certain conditions, take a little bit more out if we want to. So let's argue for these purposes, we're going to take $4 billion out of EQC. So that's the first thing. That's the first $4 billion of the rebuild. Then we get two lots of $2.5 billion from the reinsurance. That's another $5 billion. So we have $9 billion to start paying for the recovery. And then where you have house insurance, say, as an example, or motor vehicle insurance, whatever it might be, and you go to those private insurers, then that also kicks in. Now, we don't know how much that adds up to, but if we would just take a back-of-an-envelope guess, we might say that's another $6 billion. So we've got $15 billion worth of cash. So the next bit is, how much is it going to cost? Answer is probably more than we all think. These things have a habit of doing that, but we think back of the envelope again at the moment, $20 billion, but might be a bit more. So there's a shortfall of about $5 billion, maybe a bit more. The second thing that affects us is, because there's such a large amount of economic contraction, so much less activity happening in Christchurch, we earn less tax revenue. So Christchurch is our second biggest city, about 20% of our economy. You've got about 50,000 people not actually really in work in any great way, and businesses operating on a lower level. That means just less tax for the governments. That affects our revenue. And the third part of it is we're paying away expenses outside of capital costs, so the rebuilding of roads and things. We're paying away those expenses that relate to the earthquake. So after the first earthquake, we paid $8 million in sort of support payments to individuals that had lost their jobs or companies that were trying to keep their employees in work. By the time we finished the 3 months after the February 22nd earthquake, we will have paid out $250 million. So it's a very significant amount of money. So the long and short of all of this is we've got three options when it comes to paying for the earthquake. So first is you just add more debt. So New Zealand government has quite low levels of debt, but the New Zealand as a country has high levels of debt. So in broad terms, we owe about 20% of GDP at a government level. The total country owes 85% of GDP. So countries that have typically been in problems, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, those countries, they have very similar debt levels to us. They owe about 85% or more of their economy. The difference is, with the exception of Spain, it's the government that owes the money, not private sector. So, yep, theoretically we could just add it on to debt and say, well, one day a future government will take care of it. But with any sort of debt, you've got to pay that back with interest. So because our debt bill's been rising because of the previous earthquakes and because of we've had to run deficits because of the global economic crisis we inherited, all that sort of stuff. Just in 4 years from now, the interest bill on our debt alone, which will sit at around about 30% of GDP, maybe a little bit less, that is going to cost more than it currently today costs to fund all of early childhood education, the entire military in New Zealand and the entire police force. So you don't want to get to a point where your debt keeps rising because you end up having to pay a lot of interest. So that's option one, just put it on the credit card if you like. And that we don't believe that's a credible option for the government. Second option is we send you a bill for that. So that's when you hear that nice Russell Norman from the Greens talking about sending you a levy. It sounds very soothing. Problem with that is that means everyone's got to pay. So his theory is, well-off people would pay. And again, that might be a nice idea. We just don't have enough off people in New Zealand to pay for it. So he's suggesting the levy would start at about $40,000 a year. So anyone earning more than $40,000 would have to pay. And the question is how much and for how long. Don't know the answers to that in day one, but it would be thousands of dollars and it would probably be for 15 years. So let's take a family that earns $50,000. They've got 2 or 3 kids and they live in Ashburton. Do they really want to get a bill from that nice national government for $1,500 a year for the next 15 years? And I'd strongly suggest the answer to that is no. Right. So the third option is every year we have a budget. And the budget allocates new spending. It allocates total spending, but really it looks at that new bit of spending. So every year we spend a bit more. When Michael Cullen and Helen Clark were in office, they spent increasingly large amounts of money in new spending. So to put it in perspective, we used to spend about $500 million extra a year. When they came in between 1999 and 2002, they spent $1 billion extra a year every year. After 3 years, Michael Cullen said, I can't live with only spending $1 billion more, I want to spend more. And he got rid of the cap that was there. There was a cap that was sort of, self-enforced. So he just said, I'm no longer going to stick to that. In the last 5 years they were in office, they spent $2.8 billion a year extra every year on average. 1 year they spent just under $4 billion. So they spent a lot of money. So when we came in, we said, well, we've got this crisis, we can't afford to keep spending money at this rate, we're borrowing $300 million a week, this is crazy. So we cut that back to $1 billion a year, 1.1 billion. So we did that for the first 2 years. So at the start of the year, when we started to see the economy coming right, we said we're going to cut that back to 800 million. And the question is, what could we get that number to ultimately pay for the earthquake? And the answer is, we think we probably could get it fairly close to zero. So the problem with a zero budget is some things need more money, and if you don't give them more money, you will see discernible changes in the quality of experience you have. So they are primarily health and education. To a certain degree, there's a little bit that has to go into justice. So basically, we are going to spend probably the better part of somewhere between $600 and $800 million more in health, education and justice. And that means we've got to find $600 to $800 million out of what we currently spend. And the question is, can we do that? And the answer is we spend $70 billion a year on your behalf. So you're pretty sure we can find 1% without it causing riots in the streets. And so if we do that, then we get on top of our debt position, we pay for the Christchurch earthquake, and we don't directly send you a bill. And yep, there's a constituency for every dollar the government spends. So ultimately, if we don't spend it, someone will say that was money I was going to get in some form or another, and I'm not happy about that. But on the other side of the coin, we would say, well, we've got to pay for the Christchurch earthquake. And it's a very unusual strategy to go into election year not only not promising people more money, basically promising people we're not going to spend any money. So that's an interesting strategy. And the reason we're doing that is because we think we need to have a mature conversation with the New Zealand public and be honest and upfront with them. We just can't keep borrowing money forever, and we've got to pay for the earthquake. It's as simple as that. And so we're going to adjust our expenditure, and we hope that the New Zealand public will support the budget. So that's basically what's happening. And then just very quickly, and then we can move on to any questions you have, because it's relevant to your part of the world. What's been happening, if you look at the global financial crisis, which came in, so it hit New Zealand much earlier actually, because our house prices were very high, so it came in New Zealand early 2008. So we've been in recession really for a long time, even if not technically a recession. It's been quite difficult conditions for everybody. So these have been, not an easy 2.5 years to be in government, that's for sure. So we inherited a lot of things that, beyond our control, but we've had to get on and make the best of it. So when you look at growth, it would be easy to say, because the Treasury are telling us, from June of last year to potentially June of this year, growth is likely to be quite low in New Zealand. Not necessarily zero, but quite low. That may well prove to be correct, but that reflects two things. The first is that we've now had two very big earthquakes that have had a big contraction of economic activity in Christchurch. And the second thing is that at the latter part of last year, most OECD countries really slowed down. So Australia did, the UK did, they all went backwards. And the reason for that was because we had this big financial meltdown in Portugal and Ireland and Spain and these countries, and so it just slowed the world down. But what is not true is that is reflective all across New Zealand. So if you look at commodity prices, many of you will be coming from farms, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You've got sheep farmers making money for the first time in a very long time. You've got very high forestry prices. Wool is actually profitable for the first time in a very long time. Dairy is off the charts, so you've got $10 billion projected payout by Fonterra. Beef prices are high. To Australia, exchange rates are low and interest rates are quite low. So what you're seeing is a boom in commodity prices, and the question is, will that last? And my view of that is it's going to last, and it's going to last for a very long period of time. So that doesn't mean it won't move around a bit and there'll be fluctuations, but I came out of the financial markets, and the financial markets, we always used to say the trend is your friend, and the trend in Asia is young countries, very densely populated, getting immensely wealthy quickly. So China, just to give you some idea of what that looks like, in the 7 hours you were tucked up in bed last night, we sold more to China than we did in 1972 as an entire country for the whole year. So two-way trade between New Zealand and China is phenomenal. I think it's sitting at about $12 billion. It's on its way to $15 billion in the very foreseeable future. China is now our second largest market, eclipsed only by Australia. And it's not just China. If you go and talk to Fonterra, they'll tell you India is as big a market for dairy as China is. And then it's Malaysia and Singapore and Korea and Hong Kong and the Philippines, you name it. So there is phenomenal growth as Asia industrialises, gets wealthier, buys quality food. And that's probably going to happen for 20 years. So just like Saudi Arabia is getting rich with oil prices, Australia getting very rich in terms of mineral resources, New Zealand's got huge capacity to make money out of what we produce off the land. So it doesn't end the sea. So it doesn't really matter whether it's fish or wine or dairy products and all the value-added products that kind of come off that. Very, very powerful trend in that direction. Second thing is you're starting to see tourism as a very interesting market around the world. So biggest export earner for us now in New Zealand. A lot of people are starting to come to New Zealand. And third thing is the internet is the one thing that's really changing the way the world operates. So you will have seen us talking about bullying this week. So we've got to stand up to bullies and we've got to do something about that. I've just been down at Ashburton College, and not that that's specifically known for bullying, but I mean schools in general. I'm sure. Hasten to add before someone gets upset with me. Ashburton College, wonderful school. But basically, what's changing, you see, is you're seeing that change through internet technology, people putting stuff on their Facebook sites, mobile phones. The world's completely changing. So New Zealand always used to suffer the tyranny of distance. So you're a small manufacturer and you make something in Ashburton, how on earth do you sell it to the world? Now you can do it on a very cost-efficient basis with the internet. And you're seeing that with service-based industries where you're getting a lot of wealthy people who with high qualifications locating themselves in New Zealand and starting to offer their services on a worldwide basis because the internet lets them do that. So accounting firms or legal firms or architectural firms that operate 12 hours in London and 12 hours in New Zealand. And they operate 24 hours a day. Or services that will be based in Christchurch or in Ashburton at a low cost, but servicing, kind of the world. So, for instance, Canon, I opened their new processing centre and their customer help centre on the North Shore a few months ago. So if you ring from anywhere in Australia or New Zealand, you ring the North Shore in Auckland. And it's a very cost-efficient way of doing things. So modern technology allows you to do that. So if you look at the trend for New Zealand, we're in the right part of the world, producing the right things, and I think you're going to see very strong periods of economic growth over the next sort of 10 or 20 years. Second thing is just on that, the Christchurch earthquake, the rebuild is going to be phenomenal. So you are going to see an awful lot of money spent in a short space of time in Christchurch, and that for economic activity will be huge. You're a builder working in Ashburton, you're going to be busy for the next 20 years. Tell your wife you won't be home for a while. It's going to be a very busy time. So that's sort of what's going to happen there. Phenomenal sort of amount. The only other last thing I just finished on this is sometimes we compare ourselves to Australia, and in opposition we spend a long time saying, hey, there's a lot of people leaving for Australia and New Zealand needs to lift its game and do better. I stand by all that stuff, by the way. I think New Zealand does need to lift its game. I think it does need to do better. It does need to narrow that wage gap with Australia. We think we are doing that on an after-tax basis. We're starting to make progress. But for what it's worth, just to give you an idea how powerful their mineral base is in Australia, I had lunch with the Australian Secretary of the Treasury about a month or so ago. So I was asking him about the mineral effect on their economy. He said, oh, look, it's just absolutely phenomenal. Two-speed economy in Australia, the mineral sector and kind of everybody else. So we're going to spend $20 billion in Christchurch, right? In Australia, they used to spend on average between $5 and $10 billion on capital investment in their mineral sector, producing uranium mines and coal mines and gas mines, lots of stuff. In the last 3 years, the average capital spend per year has been $55 billion a year, right? And they think for the next 10 years, they'll spend between $55 and $70 billion a year. So that's why Australia is getting wealthier. It's got a phenomenal mineral base. And that's actually really good for New Zealand because 40% of our market is Australia. So when you produce a whole lot of vegetables, which you do here, they get exported to Australia. And when the Australian consumer is wealthy, it's good for you. So we don't want a weak Australia. We want a strong and getting stronger New Zealand, but not on the back of being a relatively weak Australia. We actually want a strong Australasia. And to do that, it can lift all of our wages. So that's kind of roughly where we're going. And maybe now we can take some questions on anything you like.